Welcome once again to Justified Nonetheless. I am Kevin Berger, and I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. In this video, I discuss with ChatGPT, link in the description, the null hypothesis with regard to the existence of the claimed distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P, and the ramifications of that null hypothesis on atheism. I start off asking, why is atheism held to be the null hypothesis? The answer is, atheism is sometimes considered to be the null hypothesis in discussions about the existence of a higher power because it represents the absence of belief in a deity or deities. In scientific inquiry, the null hypothesis is a starting point that assumes no significant relationship or effect. Applying this concept to discussions about the existence of a higher power, atheism is often seen as the default position because it doesn't assert the existence of any specific god or gods. However, it's important to note that the choice of null hypothesis in philosophical or religious discussions can be subjective and is context dependent. Different perspectives may consider different positions as the default, and the concept of the null hypothesis may not always apply in the same way as it does in empirical scientific experiments. I follow up by asking, are beliefs mental states? And the answer is yes, beliefs are considered to be mental states. They are a form of propositional attitude, which means they involve a mental attitude towards a proposition or statement. In the case of beliefs, a person holds a certain mental state of accepting a particular proposition as true or likely to be true. For example, if someone believes that the Earth orbits around the Sun, they hold a mental state where they accept this statement as true based on their understanding or evidence. Beliefs are a fundamental aspect of cognition and play a significant role in shaping an individual's perceptions, decisions, and behaviors. I then ask, is it true then that because atheism is held to be an absence of belief in deities, as opposed to belief in the non-existence of deities, this entails a genuine distinction between non-belief in P and belief in the negation of P? And the answer to that is, yes, that's correct. The distinction between atheism as an absence of belief in deities, often referred to as weak atheism or negative atheism, and belief in the non-existence of deities, often referred to as strong atheism or positive atheism, is an important one in philosophical discussions. Atheism as an absence of belief in deities simply means lacking a belief in gods without necessarily asserting that gods do not exist. In contrast, belief in the non-existence of deities is an affirmative position asserting that gods do not exist. So while atheism is characterized as a lack of belief in gods, it doesn't necessarily entail a positive assertion about the non-existence of deities. This distinction is significant in philosophical discourse because it reflects different levels of certainty and epistemic stance regarding the existence of gods. I then ask, in this case, would the null hypothesis then be that there is no genuine distinction between non-belief in P and belief in the negation of P? And the response to that is, in the context of philosophical discussions about atheism, the null hypothesis typically doesn't apply in the same way it does in empirical scientific experiments. The idea of atheism as an absence of belief in deities and the distinction between non-belief in P and belief in negative P are philosophical concepts used to describe different positions on the existence of gods. They are not typically framed as formal hypotheses subject to empirical testing. In a philosophical discussion, one might examine the implications and distinctions between these positions, but it's not necessarily a matter of testing a null hypothesis in a scientific sense. It's more about exploring and understanding different perspectives on the existence of deities. So I ask, are beliefs the product of electrical impulses and chemical reactions within the brain? And the response to that is yes, beliefs are ultimately rooted in the physical processes of the brain. They arise from complex interactions of neurons, neurotransmitters, and various biochemical processes. When a person forms a belief, it involves the activation of specific neural pathways and the release of neurotransmitters that influence synaptic connections. While beliefs have subjective and cognitive aspects, they ultimately have a physical basis in the brain's neural network. This perspective aligns with the understanding that our mental states, including beliefs, are emergent properties of the physical processes occurring within our brains. I ask then, are these electrical impulses and chemical reactions testable, measurable, and empirical? To which the response is yes, the electrical impulses and chemical reactions underlying beliefs are indeed testable, measurable, and subject to empirical investigation. Neuroscientists use various techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, electroencephalography, EEG, and positron emission tomography, PET, to observe and measure brain activity associated with cognitive processes, including the formation and expression of beliefs. Additionally, studies in neuroscience and psychology often employ controlled experiments and observational methods to investigate the neural correlates of belief and other cognitive functions. The empirical approach allows researchers to gather data, analyze patterns, and draw conclusions about the physiological basis of mental states like beliefs. I then ask, because belief is the product of these electrical impulses and chemical reactions, and they are measurable, testable, and empirical, does this physicality not bridge the gap and bring belief from the realm of philosophy into empirical science? And the response to that is, the physical basis of beliefs rooted in electrical impulses and chemical reactions in the brain does indeed provide a bridge between philosophical discussions and empirical science. This understanding allows for the investigation of beliefs from a scientific perspective, particularly within the field of neuroscience. Empirical studies can explore the neural mechanisms underlying belief formation, modification, and expression. They can also examine how beliefs interact with other cognitive processes and how they can be influenced by various factors such as external stimuli or interventions. However, it's important to note that while the physical basis of beliefs can be studied empirically, the philosophical and conceptual aspects of beliefs, such as their content and implications, still remain within the realm of philosophy. The scientific investigation complements philosophical inquiry, but it doesn't replace it entirely. Both perspectives contribute valuable insights into the nature and function of beliefs. I asked, haven't multiple clinical studies already substantiated a genuine distinction between the brains of atheists and religious people, using fMRI, for example? And the response to this, yes, there have been several studies that have used neuroimaging techniques like fMRI to investigate differences in brain activity between individuals with different religious beliefs or levels of religiosity. These studies have provided empirical evidence suggesting that there may be distinct neural patterns associated with religious belief and practices. For example, some studies have found differences in brain activation during tasks related to religious experiences or belief processing. These findings contribute to our understanding of the neural basis of religious beliefs and highlight the potential for empirical investigation in this area. It is worth noting, however, that these studies provide valuable insights. They are part of a larger body of research and ongoing discussions about the relationship between brain functions and religious or philosophical beliefs. The interpretation of these findings can be complex and may vary based on the specific methodologies and context of the studies. I then ask, if studies were able to reliably demonstrate the distinction between the brains of atheists and religious people, does it logically follow that a distinction should also be demonstrable between the brains of atheists who express non-belief in deities and those who express belief in the non-existence of deities? And the answer to that is, if studies were able to reliably demonstrate a distinction between the brains of atheists and religious people, it could potentially suggest there are neurological differences associated with different belief systems. However, extending this to specifically differentiate between atheists who express non-belief in deities and those who express belief in the non-existence of deities might be a bit more nuanced and challenging endeavor. Beliefs about deities and their existence are complex and multifaceted, and they may not have a one-to-one correspondence with specific, easily distinguishable neural patterns. Additionally, beliefs can be influenced by a wide range of factors, including cultural, social, and personal experience, which can contribute to the diversity of perspectives even within a group like atheism. While it's possible that future research might uncover neurological correlates associated with specific belief patterns, it's important to approach such investigation with an awareness of the complexity and diversity of human belief systems. I then ask, does the difficulty involved in accumulating and presenting evidence to substantiate an assertion absolve the claimant of the burden of proof for that assertion? To which the reply is no. The difficulty involved in accumulating and presenting evidence does not absolve the claimant of the burden of proof for their assertion. The burden of proof rests on the person making the claim regardless of the complexity or challenges in providing evidence. It is the responsibility of the claimant to provide sufficient evidence or reason to support their assertion. If providing evidence is particularly challenging, it may require more effort and resources, but it does not excuse the claimant from meeting their burden of proof. In cases where evidence is difficult to obtain, it's important to acknowledge the limitations and be transparent about the level of certainty or confidence in the assertion. So I asked, then by asserting that this distinction exists, the claimant incurs a burden of proof, correct? And the reply is yes, that's correct. If someone asserts that a specific distinction exists, they do incur a burden of proof. They are responsible for providing evidence or reasons to support their assertion. This is a fundamental process of logical argumentation and critical thinking. Making a claim without providing adequate evidence is not considered a valid or convincing argument. So then I ask, and though it may be difficult due to a variety of reasons, if such distinction exists in reality, this distinction should be demonstrable with empirical evidence, yes? And the answer is yes. If a genuine distinction exists in reality, it should in principle be demonstrable with empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is derived from observation, measurement, experimentation, and is considered a reliable way to substantiate claims about the physical world. However, it's important to acknowledge that the difficulty in providing empirical evidence may arise from various factors, including the complexity of the phenomenon, limitations in current technology, or other practical constraints. In cases where obtaining empirical evidence is challenging, researchers may need to employ creative methodologies or consider alternative approaches to gather relevant data. And I said, and if an experiment were designed to test this, the null hypothesis for that experiment would be that there is no distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P, would it not? And the answer to that is yes. In the context of designing an experiment to test the distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P, the null hypothesis would typically be formulated to assume no significant difference between these two states. This means that any observed differences would be attributed to the chance variation or other factors rather than a true distinction between the two states. The alternative hypothesis, on the other hand, would assert that there is a genuine distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P, and that this distinction can be detected through the experiment. Keep in mind that designing experiments to test philosophical concepts, particularly those related to beliefs and attitudes, can be challenging and may require careful consideration of methodology and measurement techniques. And here we get into the weeds a little bit, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit. This will be in the link in the description if you want to read what I skipped over. But here I'll pick up and say, if it is held that the null hypothesis with regard to the God claim, and in turn the null hypothesis with regard to non-belief is that there is no distinction between non-belief in P and belief for the negation of P, does it not logically follow that we should proceed as though those who express non-belief in P do believe the negation of P? And the answer is, I understand your question now, and you've brought up an important logical point. If the null hypothesis assumes that there is no distinction between non-belief in P and belief in the negation of P, then from a strictly logical standpoint, it would indeed imply that we should proceed as though those who express non-belief in P actually do believe the negation of P. This is a consequence of framing both non-belief and belief in the negation of P effectively equivalent in the context of the null hypothesis. It's a nuanced aspect of the philosophical and logical considerations surrounding belief positions. However, it's worth noting that this perspective arises from the formalism of hypothesis testing and might not necessarily capture the full complexity of philosophical discourse on beliefs and their distinctions. In practical discussions about belief, it is important to consider the broader philosophical context and individual perspectives. I then ask, and is that not problematic for those who express non-belief? To which the reply to that is yes, it can be seen as potentially problematic for those who express non-belief, especially if the null hypothesis implies that there is no meaningful distinction between non-belief in P and belief in the negation of P. This may not accurately reflect the nuanced positions and perspectives of individuals who identify as non-believers. In philosophical discussion, the distinction between non-belief in P and belief in the negation of P is often considered significant and carries implications for one's stance on the proposition. If the null hypothesis challenges this distinction, it could potentially oversimplify or misrepresent the range of beliefs and positions held by individuals, including atheists. It's important to approach these discussions with sensitivity and understanding of the complexities involved in belief systems and philosophical perspectives. Recognizing and respecting diverse viewpoints is essential in fostering productive and respectful dialogue on these topics. I then ask, is it true that while the burden of proof always falls to the claimant, whether it is a positive assertion or a negative assertion, the null hypothesis with regard to non-belief would remain non-existence? And the answer to that is yes, you're correct. In philosophical discussions, the burden of proof typically falls on the person making a claim, whether it's a positive assertion or a negative assertion. Regarding the null hypothesis with regard to non-belief, it's important to clarify that the concept of a null hypothesis is a framework primarily used in empirical scientific research, particularly in hypothesis testing. In the context of philosophical discussions about beliefs and existence, the null hypothesis may not always apply in the same way. In philosophical terms, when discussing beliefs or propositions, the null hypothesis is not a standard concept. Instead, the focus tends to be on providing arguments and evidence to support one's position, regardless of whether it's a positive or negative assertion. The question of whether the null hypothesis in empirical science translates directly to philosophical discussions is a topic of ongoing debate among philosophers. Okay. So the null hypothesis regarding the claimed distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P is to proceed as if there is no distinction, and as a result, we should proceed as those who express non-belief do in fact believe in the non-existence of any deity. I am thoroughly convinced that there is no distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P, and again, this is the null hypothesis with regard to non-belief. However, I may very well be wrong, and I acknowledge that possibility. Fortunately, as I am not asserting to know that there is no such distinction, I don't incur a burden of proof for that, unlike those who assert that there is a genuine distinction. I will continue to invite those who make that assertion to provide empirical evidence to substantiate it, but no one has so far, and I don't suspect that anyone ever will. What I have been presented with are linguistic distinctions and conceptual differences, neither of which I dispute, and neither of which substantiate a difference in reality, which is the point of contention. I have presented with faulty analogies that beg the question. I have been presented with personal anecdotes that are not independently verifiable because literally anyone can express any position, whether it's true or not, and are inconclusive because self-reporting is notoriously unreliable. This is without taking into consideration that if I am expected to accept personal anecdotes from atheists who reject the same as evidence for the existence of a deity, they are committing a special pleading fallacy. I have been presented with false equivalencies of withholding judgment with withholding belief, belief with certainty, being unconvinced with not believing, and claims of knowledge with statements of belief. I've been presented with red herrings like, I have no good reason to believe, I shouldn't believe, I want to believe as many true things and not believe as many untrue things as possible, and just because I don't believe X doesn't mean that I am asserting not X, which change the subject from belief to something else, and none of which have any bearing on the presence of belief, which again is the actual point of contention. I've seen no empirical evidence and no good reason to think that non-belief exists in reality, that there is a genuine distinction between not believing P and believing the negation of P, no independently verifiable way to differentiate between the two. A distinction that does not manifest in reality is indistinguishable from a distinction that does not exist in reality. With that in mind, I will pose the question that I have posed many times before in the past. Imagine there are three atheists in a room. One asserts to know that no deity exists. One believes that no deity exists, but refrains from asserting this as knowledge, instead conceding that he may be mistaken. The last one only lacks belief in the existence of any deity. The first can easily be distinguished from the other two by the act of making the assertion. Through what independently verifiable means might one differentiate between the other two? I'm still waiting for an answer to that question. So until next time, I implore you once again, even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they should be justified nonetheless.